Classic Lara Croft is getting something of a revival in the public consciousness nowadays, and I think that's a great thing, because I've always liked Lara. I honestly got really annoyed whenever straight white male internet personalities dismiss her out of hand for one reason or another. She's one of gaming's premier female protagonists, up there with Samus Aran and Dixie Kong as far as I'm concerned, and it's nice to see people reclaiming the classic version of the character and extolling her virtues and values now that the reboot version of Lara has completely used up any goodwill that she had ever been afforded. Something that does stick in my craw when I see people say I miss classic Lara Croft, though, is when they conflate the OG core design era Lara with the Lara as she appeared in the first Crystal Dynamics games, starting with Tomb Raider Legend. Because Tomb Raider Legend is not a classic Tomb Raider game. It's a reboot. This is a rebooted version of Lara, not her classic incarnation. She might have the same aesthetic of being a top-heavy, dual-pistols-wielding, confident badass, which puts her in the same category as classic Lara, in direct contrast to the whiny little bitch version of Lara we have in the Survivor games, but Legend Lara is very distinctly not classic Lara. They are two totally different and divergent characters. Talking about classic Lara Croft and then mentioning the core design games and the Crystal Dynamics Legend era games as if they're the same character, or even the same era of the character, is a mistake. So I want to get really analytical about this to clear up the misconception of what classic Lara Croft really is, and why the Legend incarnation of her character is emphatically not classic Lara. First, I find that Lara Croft is best explained in the most simplistic of ways to help people understand her by comparing her to other characters she's analogous to. Classic Lara Croft is a combination of Indiana Jones and Scrooge McDuck. Legend Lara Croft is a combination of James Bond and Batman. And for good measure, Survivor Lara Croft is a combination of Katniss Everdeen and Nathan Drake. And Batman. So when I say classic Lara Croft is a different character from Legend Lara, I mean that in the same way I would say Indiana Jones is a different character from James Bond, or Scrooge McDuck is a different character from Batman. I hopefully wouldn't have to explain why those characters are distinct from one another. But the Laras all have the same name, and are presented as being different versions of the same character, so I do understand the confusion of acting like Classic and Legend Lara are the same character from an outsider position. Survivor Lara is so radically and wildly different that it's easy to look at these two Laras, see they both essentially look the same, both use dual-wielding pistols, and both actually raid fucking tombs, and say, yeah, those are one version of Lara Croft. Trust me, I get it. But aesthetics aside, the thing that separates these two Laras can be broken down into three main categories: tone, backstory, and motivation. Something that cannot be avoided when discussing any version of Lara Croft is Lara murders the ever-loving shit out of a fuck ton of dudes. All three of them have a body count that should rightfully qualify them as being legally considered a natural disaster. But the difference in how that wanton violence is portrayed is vital. I'm going to show you a clip, and I want you to really reflect on how it makes you feel when you see it. Now, I don't need to ask how that made you feel, because it's obvious. It probably made you laugh, even if you've seen it countless times before. But why did it make you laugh? What we just saw was a clip of a man who was not an immediate threat considering his distance from the person he was harassing, being shot dead in the middle of broad daylight with dozens of eyewitnesses, and whose life and its loss was immediately dismissed by his killer literally without a second glance. The man was probably a trained and professed expert of his sword-slinging craft, maybe had a wife and family, certainly had parents who may miss him, and now the end result of all those years of life experience is amounting to a forgotten heap on the desert floor of a bazaar so jaded that people cheer upon seeing a life being snuffed out before their eyes. And yet, we laughed. Why? The answer is because of tone. The way this scene is being portrayed is a comedic subversion of expectations. The timing of it is portrayed as a joke. with setup and punchline. And beyond that, the wider context of where this scene takes place in the movie frames that person as merely a faceless, nameless minion, not even really worthy of mini-boss status like some of the other opponents Dr. Jones faces elsewhere in the film. These individuals are not being portrayed as people, but as obstacles for the main character to overcome. Our brains are capable of suspending disbelief and accepting the notion that we just witnessed a scene of someone being shot dead, ignoring the reality that an actor fell based on the direction he was being given offset, in timing with a smoke special effect coming out of the prop that his co-actor was using as part of the timing and blocking of the scene. So therefore, our brains are also able to contextualize that display of violence is something to be found funny, instead of a horrifying and tragic loss of human life. So what is the tone of the violence perpetrated by and inflicted on Lara Croft? Well, for Survivor Lara, the tone expects us to take the violence seriously, which is obviously completely fucking stupid because this is a video game, and no amount of graphical advancement is ever going to make this not utterly ridiculous to portray as anything even resembling realism, let alone disturbing. But for classic Lara Croft, the tone is much closer to that scene from Indiana Jones. Classic Lara is very much rooted in that 1920s adventure serial style that inspired Indiana Jones, and her adventures are rooted in the same episodic style of whip-cracking and whiz-banging adventure where death-defying feats are met with flippant disregard for any danger, and mortal encounters with gun-wielding opponents is contextually treated as the same level of obstacle as outrunning a giant rolling boulder. The focus is on conveying a sense of escapism and excitement, which allows scenes like this, where Lara Croft smiles at a non-hostile helicopter pilot before shooting him in the goddamn head like a twisted psychopath, to be conveyed as being amusing and lighthearted. The graphical capabilities of these early games also contributes to that. These aren't really people. They're blocks of polygons with low-quality textures painted on, and even the ones who qualify as named characters are still completely dehumanized as stereotypical caricatures. Compare that to the violence as portrayed in the Legend era of games. Now, this still isn't violence we're meant to take seriously, but it is still tonally different. Compare and contrast this to this. Effectively the same act, but one is more ha 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 ha, and the other is more whoa ho ho ho. Ha 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 versus ho ho ho. Am I making sense? Even with the bombast put aside, the violence is still far more down to earth. The first time Lara kills a person is depicted in Tomb Raider Anniversary, and the way it's conveyed is sort of a mix between kind of a little fucked up and holy shit, this is metal as fuck. Lara is depicted as being disturbed by her actions in this game, but she very swiftly gets over that.
I've simplified your payroll.
This is why I think she's more analogous to James Bond. When this Lara kills people, it's meant to be badass and exciting, but at the same time you see her do stuff like this and you think, maybe she's a little fucked up in the head? Again, it's the difference between this and this.
Wait, I'm just a professional doing a job.
Me too.
One is cheeky and playful, the other is awesome but has some deeper layers to it. Both of these Laras kill people, but the way they kill people and the way we're supposed to feel about it is completely different. Also, Legend Lara totally panics like a complete pussy when a T-Rex shows up, but Classic Lara remains firmly in our control, and thus is free to charge that sucker because she's the real apex predator here. The second biggest distinction between these two Laras is their backstory. I'm gonna blow some of your minds here. Classic Lara Croft's parents are not dead. Hell, they even show up at her funeral in Chronicles, so her parents outlive her, until she comes back to life in Angel of Darkness. Hell, classic Lara Croft's parents don't even particularly like her. They disowned her ass and cut her off from the family fortune. That's right, that means Croft Manor is not a family estate. It is a private residence, which Lara purchased with her own money. This is in stark contrast to the Lara Croft in the reboot games, where her parents are dead and both were a positive and loving influence on her, and she inherited their vast fortune and lives in a family estate that presumably belonged to her bloodline for generations, considering there's a friggin' tomb beneath the grounds. Both of these Laras were born with a silver spoon in their mouth, but classic Lara was expected to conform to the lifestyle of stuffy British aristocracy, and when she stepped out of line, her parents burned all bridges with her. Whereas Legend Lara had almost everything in her life handed to her on a silver platter. Every penny that classic Lara has, she earned through her own hard work and gumption, without any safety net or handout. I guess what I'm saying is, she made her fortune by being tougher than the toughies, smarter than the smarties, sharper than the sharpies, and she made it square. That sets these two Laras hugely apart. I don't really see how you can conflate these two characters as both being classic Lara and the same person, when if you ask them both how they feel about their parents, they'd have two completely different answers. Legend Lara was loved, but ultimately lost her parents when she was very young. She never got to the point where she was expected to enter into an arranged marriage to maintain noble custom, and based on what we see of this Lara's parents, it's unknown and perhaps unlikely that they would have expected their daughter to do so. Hell, this Lara's father, Richard Croft, was also an adventuring archaeologist, so Legend Lara is even following in her father's footsteps. Classic Lara is charting her own course in life, following her own path and on her own 2 feet, regardless of the disapproval that she faced for doing so. And that dovetails into the final distinction between these two Laras, their motivation. Classic Lara Croft is, in a word, greedy. Her motivation is a thirst for adventure, daredevil, death-defying escapades for its own sake, fulfilling a sense that living on the razor's edge and surviving through her own gumption is the only time she feels truly fulfilled. She globe-trots and explores just because it's fun, and plunders ancient relics the likes of which no mortal has laid eyes on in hundreds or thousands of years, just for the sake of getting to say she's done so. She accumulates an extensive amount of wealth in doing all this, but that comes across more like as a means to an end, a method of funding her lifestyle rather than the goal in and of itself. And she displays the artifacts she uncovers in her own personal residence to keep as trophies, rather than donating them to museums for the betterment of historical understanding. Probably just as well, considering half these relics could be used to end the world or something. This Lara is inherently selfish, but that plays into the escapist fantasy she's a vessel for, and a lot of us would probably see it as inspiring that she left behind the lap of luxury in order to live out her personal ambitions and find fulfillment doing something that makes her happy. Compared to Legend Lara Croft, for whom the only reason she even seems to roll out of bed in the morning is because of her goddamn daddy issues. Yeah, Crystal Dynamics saw that Angelina Jolie movie and thought having an archaeologist adventuring heroine who was motivated entirely by crying over her fucking dead dad was the perfect way to reinvent this classic character. Hell, they liked making Lara's entire life revolve around her stupid fucking dead parents so much, they did it twice, with the Survivor reboot version of the character also being entirely motivated by her family drama and nothing else. Every single thing Lara Croft does in the Legend games is based entirely around her daddy issues. Even the remake of the first game is completely rewritten to insert Dickie Croft into the lore of the Scion. That's not how you pronounce it. And creating this inane backstory where Richard worked with Natla in order to try and uncover the Scion, and now Lara is literally following in his footsteps. In the original game, Natla has Larson ambush Lara after getting her piece of the scone, just to be an evil, betraying villain bitch, Indiana Jones style robbing the adventurer just so they don't have to do any of the hard work. In Anniversary, they do it because, oh, they know that Lara would be too obsessed with her father's legacy to give up the Scion, so that they just have to betray her before she takes matters into her own hands. In the original game, Lara's confrontation with Natla is purely pragmatic, and based on the objective conflict between Lara not wanting the world to be fucked up by an Atlantis-ass monster bullshit, and Natla being a twisted tyrant. In Anniversary, Natla has a completely asinine "join me so we can rule the world together" speech, and Lara literally apologizes to her father before destroying the Scion and saving the world. It's fucking dumb. Maybe Legend Lara goes on adventures just for kicks off screen, but I wouldn't know, because we never fucking see that. Every single adventure this Lara has that we play through is dedicated entirely to resolving Croft family baggage and is motivated by her mommy and daddy issues. I don't like it. Classic Lara only needs to hear about a new lost city or sunken relic to be motivated to go out and find it. She's the kind of person who would try to uncover the Maltese MacGuffin. Why does she climb the mountain? Because it is there. Legend Lara Croft would need to read in her fucking dad's old journal that his greatest regret in life was never getting to watch the final season of Columbo in order to motivate her fat ass to pop a DVD in and watch some mindless entertainment for the night. I could keep getting granular and nitpicky about this, but those are the three biggest differences between OG core design Lara Croft and the rebooted Crystal Dynamics Lara Croft. I hope you see now that these are two completely distinct and not at all comparable versions of this character who had nothing in common aside from completely superficial aesthetic similarities. If you like Lara Croft as depicted in the Legend timeline of games, then more power to you, but please stop talking about her as if she qualifies as quote-unquote classic Lara Croft, because she isn't classic Lara Croft. There is only one Lara Croft that can be truly considered a classic, and count me as one of the people who would like to see her return. Not in her neutered legendary timeline incarnation, but her true depiction from the PS1 days. This is classic Lara Croft. The one and only.